The biggest dilemma is trying to convince those people in power that diversity inclusion does not hurt them. It doesn't hurt their children, their legacy, their families' ability to have their own sustainability. And that's a huge, that's a heavy lift.
Welcome back to Futurists.world, your home for big ideas about the future. I'm Mike Hill, and today we have an important new episode about the future of diversity featuring two very special guests. Vanessa Mason is the Research Director for Institute for the Future Vanguard Partnerships in Silicon Valley, and she is also the founder of Future of Belonging, which explores how the idea of belonging is being redefined by technology. And Vanessa is also considered to be one of the 200 black women in tech to follow on Twitter. I'm also thrilled to be joined by Yul Anderson, coming to us from Boston, but based in Georgia, USA. He's an associate fellow at the World Academy of Art and Science. He's the president and founder of the African American Future Society and hosted the Future of Black American Futures Lab at UNESCO, which also featured Vanessa. Vanessa, Yul, thanks for joining me. I'm going to start off with a really obvious question. We're talking today about the future of diversity, and I want to talk to you about diversity and inclusion. What does it really mean?
I'm glad to be here. It seems as if diversity and inclusion seems to be a newfound drug amongst the global community, something to be reinvestigated and spurned up and to try to get global buy-in of its importance to economic growth and sustainability. So in that light, it means to give everyone an opportunity to identify and develop a sustainable level of interaction on the planet so that they can live and have good sustenance, good education, good housing, good work.
Vanessa, is it meaningful to you, this idea of diversity and inclusion? Yul's identified that there's a real movement at the moment around this. What does it mean to you?
I think the movement is really, it's a recognition of how in our present we've gone horribly wrong with many of the things that you're saying that what diversity and inclusion are supposed to represent. And I also think it's us running up against the constraints of what diversity and inclusion has been operationalized to be. A lot of it has been around how can we sort of directly link this to economic growth. It's a lot about sort of like making widgets out of people and how those people fit in part of a larger whole without really thinking more both conceptually and unfortunately more inclusively about what is a world in which everyone belongs, where everyone is included, actually really look like. And so I think these movements are going to fall short. Like there certainly have been no end of civil rights movements throughout, American history, throughout history in other countries, in which people have consistently been fighting for more civil rights, more sort of social inclusion, the right to have like the practice of culture, speak their language. And I think a lot of those are missing within the sort of like more laser focused notion of diversity and inclusion without really thinking about belonging on a community and on a more cultural scale.
Yeah. And Yul, what do you think it means in terms of metrics that particularly companies are trying to build around this idea of diversity and inclusion? Are quotas even helpful in this discussion?
Well, I think the metrics can sometimes be misleading. I think at the end, if the metrics were measured appropriately, we wouldn't be where we are now, which is this mad rush, to try to satisfy the people that do not have, the people that have not achieved that sustainability. Yeah. It was so interesting. I was in the car most recently with two young girls, maybe 5 and 6, and they said they were best friends. And one young girl had the iPad and she's playing a game on it, and the other one said, "You're supposed to share. You're not sharing. This isn't fair." And the one that had the iPad was perfectly content, And so it's a question of what you're measuring and what are the true goals and the outcomes of what you're trying to measure. And I'm not exactly sure that diversity inclusion in the past meant social sustainability for everyone. I think it was a widget, as Vanessa mentioned, as far as consumerism. But I don't think it ever meant sustainability.
All right, so let's reframe it on a longer horizon, like 10 years in the future. Vanessa, what's it mean to us? How are we damaged by a lack of diversity? What does it mean for us going forward in time if we're not diverse enough?
I mean, I think there's this sort of immediate kind of physical safety component of it if we're just looking at an American context. Like an issue of police brutality is one in which that is disproportionately experienced by Black people, by people of color, but nonetheless is a problem for everyone because the police are over-policing in some areas and under-policing in others. That means that there is a lack of investment in public safety overall that is damaging for all of us. So I think that's something where you can sort of draw like straight through lines into this sort of lack of that and start to spin out the consequences of that. If people are being imprisoned more, then that means that those are families that are broken up. That means that those are people who aren't working in jobs. That's less wealth creation. Like there's sort of no end of talking about the consequences and the damages of that. I think the ways in which we haven't really been talking about it are more in the sort of larger scale ways that we see in kind of these big breaks in how we kind of understand what countries are and what they're doing, and understanding where that goes. And so, you know, the sort of everyone's talking about political polarization now, like obviously a lot of misinformation and disinformation, the lack of trust and sort of human relationships that are impeded by a lack of diversity are ultimately destroying our social fabric and our ability to actually come together to address things like climate change. Like without that sort of trust and bonds and care and connection that we all need to have in order to rise to this immense challenge, I really worry that we're going to continue to falter, and we see that now in a lot of the climate change impacts.
Yeah, and that damage feels like it could just get worse and worse, like you're saying, unless we do something real quick. So how do you feel about these, you know, even greater chasms that are emerging? And what do we need to do now to limit that damage going forward?
Well, I think one of the things that I noticed and researched is, and what Vanessa was talking about in regards to policing, is the overall impact of AI and the one-sidedness of the data that's going inside of the AI algorithm. And so, you know, if we don't get balance there, then the outcomes of AI will result in more over-policing and more, you know, over-intrusions of people's privacy because the system is built upon itself on this biased information. I think the dangers of not having diversity and inclusion is the lack of balanced information that is fair and equitable, which results in a level playing field. And when I say level playing field, I just mean a sustainability index that everyone can thrive on. Whether you're earning $25,000, $300,000, or $3 million, you should have an opportunity to have a sustainable lifestyle that is comfortable, affordable, that you have the appropriate nutrition, housing, and education, no matter what economic range of income you're acquiring. And right now, we just see a terrible imbalance to that. And I think some of the disruptions that we're witnessing now is a direct impact of many, many, many years of our present capitalistic system imposing on the lives of people that are striving for sustainability, you know?
Yeah, I think that's a great way of putting it. And clearly there's still a lack of opportunity out there. So Vanessa, I want to ask you, how do you actually succeed in building diverse teams, political parties, organizations, movements? What's the key to that? How do you do that in a meaningful way?
Well, without sort of unlocking the key to all of that, I think that a lot of what we saw, at least earlier this year, was a lot more discussion about anti-racism as a framework, which basically just uses the premise that if, you know, we all live in societies in which racism is part of the sort of structure and infrastructure of how things work. And so in order to not be racist, you have to be actively anti-racist. And so I think a lot of organizations are on this journey to try to figure out how to actually be an anti-racist organization. I can't think of a ready example at this point of one in which I could literally say that one's branded as an anti-racist organization. But that said, I do think that this requires really fundamentally rethinking like how the organization is structured, how it, like what it does, who does this particular work. I think a lot of this has been limited before when we're talking about diversity and inclusion within organizations. It really gets limited to recruiting, and it misses kind of the forest for the trees, as Yul was saying, in terms of like, what are the products and services that this organization is producing? What are the impacts of those products and services on the customers, on the communities that they're operating in? How are they sort of thinking about who they supply to and how they get suppliers? Are you running an organization in which it's sort of like my way is the highway, or is this really one in which power is shared across levels of the organization, across levels of expertise? Like these are all like big, weighty questions that aren't going to be solved with, a diversity initiative during Black History Month. Like there's something that really takes fundamentally rethinking how organizations are, how they come together, and not only just come together in their sort of founding, but also continue to evolve over time. Like, is there an ability to adapt to the circumstances that are emerging as our world is changing around us? And that takes a fundamental change in mindset, a change in communication, a change in who has power, who has influence, and how that's actually acted upon, and one in which ways in organizations need to do that in a more adaptive, actively learning kind of fashion. And so, I think that there's some organizations that are getting some of those things better than others. But at the end of the day, like we're all learning how to do this well. And I think the more that we remind ourselves that generally in the course of our human history, we haven't truly had diverse societies coexist side by side in a way that is helpful for people and planet. And so this is something that we are all endeavoring to create together. And because we're all learning, we all need to give ourselves both a bit of grace and compassion, as well as like call us to heal, to say, okay, what you're doing is not okay. And like, this is how we can start to figure this out together.
This is totally not okay. I also realize that someone like me is potentially part of the problem, even though I don't mean to be. So what can I do about it? Like if I'm thinking, maybe, I'm not hiring in a diverse enough way. Maybe my ideas aren't open-minded enough, for all types of reasons. What's your advice to me, guys? What do I do?
Well, I'll take a stab at that. One of the things is that we're still pretty much a young civilization, globally even, yes? And so maybe the public administrative theorists that talked about organizational management were good in their initial concept of thinking about organizations and groups, but yet it morphed into something much more racist, so to the point that we get groupthink. So while you are doing what you're doing, as a system, as an organization, as a groupthink, you pretty much hire people that look and think like you, that make you feel comfortable.
Yeah.
As opposed to necessarily truly looking for the person that can provide you the best information or performs or outperforms everybody else. So even if they don't outperform everyone else, now your conscious bias comes in from your organizational theorists of public administration theory, and you end up hiring a lot of people that look and think just like you. So in order, in my opinion, we're still pretty young at that, right? I mean, that's a post-World War II, philosophy, methodology. And so with systems thinking now and the use of the internet, now we're much more aware of the Arab Spring and the era of our ways. And so at the end of the day, we either leave cognitive decision-making and hiring processes up to the computer. Hopefully that the computer, however, doesn't utilize racist bias AI algorithms to continue to hire the staff, right? That they're truly going to be fair.
I like it, Yul. So you're saying that there's a human element here, and that human element is the problem. It's a historical problem. But if we're using technology to solve that problem, and there's inherent bias in it, we're just going to end up in the same place. So technology may not be the only solution here. Guys, I want you to be really candid and honest, because I want to hear this, and I think our audience do too. Sometimes, that you don't even realize that you're not embracing diversity in a way that, you should. And, in your heart, you feel, And like Yul's just described, you might be inadvertently doing just that, just hiring people just kind of who are like you, look like you, sound like you, think like you, because that makes you feel comfortable. How do we get beyond that, Vanessa? What can we do?
I mean, I think that Yul was talking a little bit about, how can we sort of use technology for the tool that it is to make things that are easier, clearer for us to understand. As much as, using AI for hiring and sort of pattern matching to past employees, like obviously we know that to be a bad practice. There's plenty of case studies that demonstrate this. But I do think that we can use technology to better understand skills and potential for skills in which we have not been able to do before, that we can't simply transmit through a resume, and do that in a blinded fashion so that we don't kind of have, whether it's unconscious bias or people actually choosing to selecting people on the basis of things that they think represent competence. And so I think starting to, again, back to this sort of metrics question, like what is it that we are trying to optimize for, and how can we use tools that we have available to optimize for those outcomes? And so if the outcomes are, we want to be in an organization where we have, some amount of difference of perspective, of people coming in and being able to tell us things that we don't already know, well, then you need to optimize for some level of randomness. You need to optimize for people having, over-indexing in some skills and under-indexing in others, so that you can be able to actually see that. And right now we don't do that. We optimize for, we'll optimize for school status, we optimize for, are you at the right company that, that I want to poach you from? And those all sort of things only serve to reinforce biases that are already embedded in the decisions that have been made prior. And so I think those are some small ways of optimizing for difference. Like I had an interview in my newsletter with someone, Elena Giralt, we were just talking about, algorithms are just ways of calculating, they're ways of sort of finding things. And so you can optimize for sort of different outcomes, like at the end. And I think it's making that decision, committing to what we actually want to optimize for. I think a lot of companies aren't necessarily committed to what they say that they're committed to, because they haven't made the necessary changes to achieve that. And then once we make that commitment, actually optimizing for those outcomes and evaluating what happens at the end. And again, be in this mode of continuously learning and continuously adapting.
So we need to have that vision on a longer horizon of what a diverse future looks like, embrace it now and build it into the targets, is what I hear you saying there. It sounds really sensible to me. Yul, before you were talking about what I would call equal opportunity, so that people can just be sustainable if they want to be, if they're on a low or high income. Are there any success stories that you see in your day-to-day organizations who are doing a good job of this?
I'm sorry for laughing. At the end of the day, no, that's why we're having this discussion.
Yeah.
You can drive across America in any one shaped place and find deserted cities, or you can find abject poverty ghettos, right? Yeah. And you can find affluence where people just, lace themselves in gold and diamonds. At the end of the day, if we were successful, then the people that live in the slums and the ghettos would not revolt or march, because they would have a semblance of sustainability.
Yeah.
Their needs would be met. And so at the end, it's terrible. No, I do not see any example right now where every level of the stratus of economic scale, people are happy and content where they are. I haven't seen that yet. I think at the end of the day, though, if I'm only earning $25,000, there should be a sustainability index for me where I'm comfortable, though. And I just haven't seen that yet.
Yeah.
Then I will say that IFTF, like we recently released a number of different post-pandemic scenarios, as well as a toolkit to your point about trying to create that vision of where is it that we're actually trying to get to. I think we've been locked in this paradigm of a lot of like incremental changes and tweaks and everything. And like, that's part of the reason why we haven't got there. We simply are not dreaming big enough. And I also want to highlight too, that the people who are most impacted by our current systems and decisions have the least bandwidth to be able to dream and imagine, because they are simply under the duress of not having their basic human needs met. And so any kinds of ways that we can find to bring people in for this sort of vision envisioning and being able to imagine, which is why the UNESCO workshop that you put together was so really wonderful, that we are actively trying to think of like what are ways in which we can imagine a world where people are like happy and cared for, communities are connected, that sort of engagement is the norm and not really this sort of aberration when something has gone horribly wrong. I think that's something, again, that benefits all of us. And because of that, it's something we all need to all participate in.
Good point, Vanessa. We recently had your colleague at Institute for the Future on the show, Bob Johansson, and he was talking about categorical thinking and full spectrum thinking, and the idea of categorizing people being something of the past, categorizing all things really. So I want to ask you about if you've got a team that has diversity in it, how do you celebrate that diversity without inadvertently categorizing members of your team?
I'm sorry, and you said categorizing members of your team at the end of that?
Yeah, it's about, so I'm talking about, we don't want to categorize people, right? So it's about how do you take this idea of diversity and inclusion, that we're coming from different places, we're different. How do we celebrate that idea without inadvertently categorizing someone?
I get it. Yeah, we most recently I was at the World Academy of Art and Science Global Leadership Summit. I think Vanessa was on the UNESCO Future Summit meeting. I think she was involved in that.
Yes.
And at the end of the day, no one in power wants to give up anything, right? I mean, and so it's a huge sales pitch to try to say to someone that's in power, if we can afford, 300,000 people a sustainability index that provides them, nutrition, housing, XYZ, XYZ, you will not lose anything. I think that's the biggest dilemma is trying to convince those people in power that diversity inclusion does not hurt them. It doesn't hurt their children, their legacy, their families' ability to have their own sustainability. And that's a huge, that's a heavy lift. And if we were successful at it, we wouldn't be at this point where we are today. So we have not found the appropriate sales pitch language to get the people to give up a little bit to help everybody else.
Yeah, which talks to systemic issues around capitalism and the way the system's currently working right now. Vanessa, before we move on to that, I want to get your thoughts on this idea of celebrating diverse teams. Diverse people in your community, diverse people that you work with. How do you do that without categorizing?
Well, I like to think of it in a metaphor. If you go to a sporting event and you are seated courtside versus in the nosebleed seats or behind the goalpost, you're all watching the same game. However, you are not having the same experience of watching that game. There's some things that you're going to see. Some people will see things better than others in sharper detail and will have, a different kind of reaction to that. And I think of building diverse teams in the same way. Like you're just looking for people who are looking at the same, looking at the same thing, but simply from different vantage points. And so, that doesn't require categorization necessarily. I think it just means that, have you sort of created a 360 view of whatever it is that you're trying to achieve.
Yeah.
I think also to Vanessa's point, I like that that analogy about the sporting event, because those people in the nosebleed seats, they never once complain that they're having a bad seat, but they do celebrate the dunk, the goal score. They're all celebrating at the same time when the ultimate score is being made, but no one complains, which is an amazing feat, actually. I think that people in the nosebleed seats should start marching, down to courtside, but they don't. And so somewhere down the line, there's an acceptance. And we need to figure out what that acceptance is in order for the planet to move forward, or else we're going to find ourselves cascading into more chaos.
The pandemic has pushed us to, more remote working from home. Do you think this might accelerate that idea of getting a more even playing field, Yul and Vanessa? You're talking about this analogy of the sports game. I love it. Does the idea of actually being able to work from anywhere now help to bring down any of these barriers, or is it going to do the opposite, do you think?
I don't know if when I was talking about equality, I was meaning that everyone gets the same portion. I think Vanessa clearly said, there's definitely a stratification of experience, but yet the people at the worst experience don't necessarily, I don't want to use the word brainwashing, but maybe they don't, they've just come to accept that the experience that they're having at the games is a satisfying experience. Now, maybe in the future that requires more, I'm going to just go off on the deep end here. Maybe that requires more lenient drug use for the people that, need to overcome their condition, to learn how to accept it. But again, I love that analogy. I'm tongue-tied now because the people in the nosebleed seats love the game. And they're happy with the dunk. It's almost as if they experience what the people at the courtside experience. That dunk is just as exhilarating as sitting at courtside. That's an amazing, I love that. Wow.
I love it too, Vanessa. I love the game idea. And I guess what I'm thinking of here is with the technology that's coming online, we can all kind of have courtside seats, right? We might not end up going to that stadium in the future. We're all going to be courtside because we're going to be tapping in through VR or whatever. And I guess that's what I'm saying about as the pandemic has kind of pushed us back into our homes and working more remotely. Is it becoming more of a meritocracy, or do we still have all of those same barriers still to overcome?
I think it's some kind of middle ground. I do think that it levels things for folks that, the competitive pools are now much larger than what they used to be. You're not just recruiting from a particular locality, you're recruiting from everywhere. And so having more competition and having companies more oriented around like how to find top talent may favor folks who might not have been able to, say, move to the Bay Area and then find a job at the top startup here and afford our massive cost of living, which unfortunately still is not going down fast enough. So I do think that those sort of things help other people get in. But you have to remember too that people are still being interviewed over video. Our interviewing practices are still not particularly wonderful. Even if you're someone who's a top, I don't know if you've seen some of the news here in at least the States with Google and the AI researcher, Temnet Gebru, who was forced out of Google. And it was, a lot of it was, the sort of story of it was poor research practice, but the sort of underlying parts of it is that she was rather outspoken about how Google was not a welcoming work environment for people of color. And so I think those dynamics still being at play, particularly in a world of remote work where you don't have the same kind of relationships and maybe cover that you might have had in an office environment, and again, that same sort of trust, are actually going to make things more difficult for people of color inside of organizations. And so I think as we look out to this next decade and post-pandemic, again, this is, not just focusing on the sort of narrow notion of remote work and talent and recruiting. It's about how does the organization altogether work, how do people collaborate? What is the sort of measure of success that they're looking for? What is being incentivized? And sort of what is actually happening versus what is unspoken. There's a lot of sort of, even in that story, a lot of unspoken rules that apparently were broken or were talked about that were not surfaced when that situation happened. And so all it is to say that I think that, remote work, is and will continue to be a challenge for thinking about how we can actually foster diverse and inclusive companies going forward. It's just that the nature of the challenges will change that we maybe would have otherwise had inside of the office.
One of the other things Vanessa, you were touching upon is the remote work, the remote work aspect. And that, again, brought me back to the basketball game or the sports. I really love that. At the end of the day, the equalizing factor is the fact that everyone can work remotely. And at the end of the day, everyone can utilize an avatar that's acceptable to your superior. So at the end of the day, possibly in the future, no one is going to have a racial identity at all.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe everyone just uses an avatar that the boss says, this is what you're going to use in order for me to recognize you as an employee. You're going to look just the way I tell you to look. Whether that's like the mask that they wear for V for Vendetta, right? Everyone just looks the same. And the only thing that's going to change is possibly your login ID number, your username and password. And that will, in effect, create a level playing field where everyone gets the same experience. I think COVID-19 is making that more of a reality for people, especially people that are not as welcomed in the workplace for fear or intimidation or whatever it might be. But it's a lot more palatable to employ me as a remote worker than it is to actually have me be in your physical space within 10 feet of you, where your biases and your fear about me as an individual come into play, where you might purposefully fire me because you biasly feel endangered by my being in your space. So the situation in Google is probably many levels of all of that. And unfortunately, because of that, she gets pushed out, and so she may want to claim racial bias or whatever she may want to claim in order to justify her existence. But if it was me, I would create a rival company against Google, and make it geared towards the disenfranchised, which are the black and brown and all the other people. There's nothing that says that Google has a 100% ironclad grip on all the Africans in the African continent, for example. Maybe there should be an African Google, and maybe this lady should go and do that because she understands the algorithm. But instead of doing that, she wants to be part of the culture of the organization, which goes back to that administrative theory about organizations and stuff. I'm only hoping that the use of the internet, the realization of COVID-19, making people more aware of their existence on the planet, their existence within society, forces some level of equality of access. And then, of course, that leads us down the road to bandwidth and all the other capabilities that people may not have. But I think it's going to drive and morph the internet more so, even all these Zoom meetings. Now the internet's being used in ways it's never been used before. And so I think, even now the internet's even shifting while we're talking, and possibly by January, February, even the internet will be different, and it'll be more categorized in the sense that more people with better bandwidth and access will enter different type of chat rooms and get differing variants of access than the poor Southerner that's, just out in the field picking cotton. Right now, most people just use the internet to collect email. And I'm sure that wasn't it could have been its primary intention, because I remember XYZ email years ago where you had the little orange lettering and the bright green lettering. But I think the internet's going to change. I think it's going to be a huge equalizer. I think at the end of the day, organizations, businesses will be more equitable and fair, because I think at the end of the day, with the use of distance, access, and there won't be the need to have the person in the office. And so therefore I can tolerate you a lot easier, and therefore I don't mind hiring you. And so the core group will be the only group that's in the office, which may still be groupthink. They may still be of all one racial denomination, but at least more people will be able to be hired. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, and I guess I just want to add one thing too, and just thinking about these large companies like that Yul that you spoke about, she could go off and found another company, but I think part of the problem in this world of remote work and how it's played out, at least, is that it's 5 to 6 companies that basically run all of the services that we need and able to have this world of remote work. And that level of consolidation, the price of that is surveillance. Microsoft Teams now is continuously rolling out products to be able to surveil employees. Google obviously is surveilling in both Google and Facebook. And as it turns out, if this lawsuit is true, that they colluded together to be able to track us across the internet. And so I do think that, while remote work does provide us a certain level of freedom in one sense, that's also locking us into this paradigm of, if we want to be able to practice remote work, which by the way, still is not the majority of the economy, most jobs need to be done in person, that we are, for the luxury, that freedom of remote work, we are signing on to be surveilled. And so I do think that is a trade-off that is actually paradoxically probably going to push worker rights in some really new and interesting ways. Like we've already seen some movement around like tech unionization, which people are thinking like, why do tech workers need to have unions? But I do think that now that we have more of these practices becoming increasingly mainstream and experienced by a lot more people, that, this question of privacy and surveillance and how much sort of power does work have over the rest of our lives, like whether it's our attention or whether it's our privacy inside of our own homes, is increasingly going to really push what does it mean to actually be at work. And I think that's an entire diversity and inclusion question altogether that has dimension to that.
That is such a good point, Vanessa. And Yul, thank you for talking sci-fi. Now you're talking my language. So I did want to ask you about this. Do you guys get any inspiration from science fiction or speculative fiction about what a more diverse future might look like? Vanessa, to your point, something better that we can aim at?
Yul, I don't know if you're going to.
I know, I'm only laughing again. We had so many science fiction people and Afrofuturists part of our group. It was really, really fun. Oh my God. Oh my God, it was so many layers. The answer is yes. I do get inspiration from sci-fi, from Afrofuturists. Yes, I'm hoping that what I'm seeing, the talks about the universal income, which again is passé already, now it's already something else, will come into fruition. I think people are already talking about redefining the word WORK, and they're redefining the word JOB, because they're going to be totally different in the years coming. And yes, but the quick answer is yes, I get great inspiration from what I'm seeing.
How about you, Vanessa?
Yes, very much so the same, although I still have a mile-long reading list to get through so many things. I did just stumble across, oh my gosh, her name is completely eluding me, but she's the author of this sort of short novel series called Infomocracy. It's basically looking at the confluence of like democracy and information. And she just announced that she's teaching a course actually starting in a few weeks called Predictive Fictions. And so within the course, she's really just looking at a lot of different disciplines, inclusive of sci-fi, that really get to how our visions of the future are constructed from the ways that we think, socially, from our economic thought. And so sort of the forecasts that come out of that from sci-fi and the sort of speculation and thinking about who's telling those stories, how they're telling those stories, how dystopic or how possibly tech-centric that they are. And so I just think that there's so much both inspiration to draw from science fiction and also a call for us to have more science fiction that isn't technocentric and also painting dystopias as well. And so yes, I love, we had a huge conversation, of course, about Octavia Butler, which everyone is having this year, that really talks about, of course, how much she got right and how we can not still keep going down that path of the world that she was trying to warn us about.
Oh, right on. Okay, so after this, we'll put our heads together and figure out who that artist is, and we'll add that to the show notes so the audience can check it out. All right, guys, we're almost at the end of our journey today. I want to ask you both before we wrap up, and you've already started answering this question, but when it comes to the future of diversity, are you feeling optimistic or pessimistic? Yul, I'll start with you.
Oh, I'm absolutely optimistic. I am so optimistic, it's crazy. I honestly think in the United States, we're going to see many, many, many more diverse members of the global community being elected to the House and Senate. We're going to see many more Kamala Harris's and Barack Obama's and and all the others that are being elected. And the United States may become the true United States of the globe, of the planet. And so I'm honestly hoping to see that happen. I think it's going to be great for the country and for the planet if we can diversify the people of power within our democracy here in the U.S.
Right on. And Vanessa, how are you feeling? Optimistic or pessimistic about the future of diversity?
I am cautiously optimistic. I look a lot of like the mutual aid efforts that have come out of the pandemic, a lot of the sort of care and community work that was already ongoing and that has continued even more. I think that the political shift in January, at least for the United States, is really going to catalyze a really sharp turn for people kind of both being able to grieve everything that we've lost this year, as well as really being able to understand like what does it mean to be part of a community, and what does that actually require. I think that our creators and sort of care workers and sort of all of those folks that have been doing the labor that isn't necessarily prized in a capitalist system, but obviously is essential work, as it turns out, are really going to sort of show us a new way of how we can connect at local levels. And I think that sort of grassroots kind of shift is really going to power a lot more sort of respect and embrace and just a whole new re-envisioning of diversity inside of the country.
Well put, Vanessa. Yul, Vanessa, thanks so much for joining us on the show. It's been so great to have you talking about the future of diversity. That's a wrap for now. Thanks. As always, share, like, comment, follow, and tune in to Futurists.world. Yul, Vanessa, thanks again, and look forward to catching up with you soon.
Thank you.